My name's Matthew Bunn. I am the faculty lead for the project on managing the atom. And I want to welcome you all here today for a discussion of the Ukraine crisis and in particular its nuclear dimensions, this being a managing the atom seminar. And we are extraordinarily fortunate today to have two terrific experts on this topic. Ambassador Stephen Pifer is now at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. He was ambassador to Ukraine. He's been involved in nuclear arms control for many, many years, including in recent times some quite insightful writings on ways to address some of the current challenges in arms control. And he was one of the key negotiators of the Budapest Memorandum that governed Ukraine's nuclear disarmament. Dr. Mariana Budjeryn is a research associate at Managing the Atom, and she is the author of a new book on the topic of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament, Inheriting the Bomb, which will be coming out from Johns Hopkins University Press shortly. Without further ado, let me turn it over to the two of them. Stephen, do you want to start? Stephen, I believe you have to unmute yourself.
Mariana was going to go first, but
okay, I apologize.
Big direction here.
Okay, I'm glad. I'm happy to start, and I'll start with a bit of a historical perspective as to how did we get here. But before, let me see if I could share my screen. There we go. Can we all see the shared screen? Before I start, though, I would like to express my gratitude and my appreciation to all of those, and many of you are present in this audience, my colleagues and friends who have personally reached out to me knowing that I am from Ukraine, that my family still lives in Ukraine, and that have expressed their hopes for peace and their concern with my family who are still there. Given just how tense the situation is, your expressions of concern are really very greatly appreciated. So we will be talking today about a nuclear dimension of the Ukraine crisis, so focusing primarily on one of those that pertains to Ukraine's nuclear disarmament in the early 90s. But as Matt had mentioned in his introduction, there are several. There's more than one nuclear dimension to this crisis, given that the current tension is ultimately between two nuclear superpowers, two states that together possess 90%, the lion's share of world's nuclear arsenal. So the reason why we're here today is this. Right, there's been a huge buildup, relatively large buildup of Russian forces, mostly infantry and armor on Ukraine's borders that sort of horseshoe it from the south through the west, the eastern part, the eastern border, and up north from Belarus. This map shows that there's 87,000 personnel and the equipment that's been drawn to the Ukrainian borders, mostly from other military districts in the Far East. And if you look at the date of this map is July 2020. So this has been the case. So one of the things that I'd like to start with is to say that this has been a process that has been transpiring now for over a year, and it's coming to a head now with the political demands and tensions. But this map was presented by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense to OSCE over a year and a half ago. Right now, I apologize, this is the best map I could get. It's in Ukrainian, but I tried to translate sort of the rough kind of numbers of forces. So the troops have increased to 94. Recently, we've heard 127,000. again, in this kind of large arc surrounding Ukraine from three sides. One of the questions that we might ask is, why Ukraine? How is it possible that a country that most Americans could probably not even find on the map just a short time ago is once again, and has been repeatedly actually in the last, I don't know, decade, I suppose, certainly since 2014, is at the center of these really grave tensions between the United States and Russia. And again, we all worry, especially at managing that, that we want to contain this crisis from turning into conflict and from ever risking escalating into any kind of nuclear standoff between the United States and Russia. So there's many schools of thought, and there's a whole cottage industry now of analysts that are trying to figure out why this is happening and what should be the best US response. And we have sort of more realists, someone like Steve Walt at this institution, and Graham Allison, and previously John Mearsheimer, that are saying, Ukraine is not in US core interest. We should disengage. We should sort of let them sort this between Ukraine and Russia by themselves. The US has overreached and overstepped. We have more of kind of Atlanticists, I should say, or liberals saying, this is a standoff between democracy and authoritarianism, or else, U.S. has vested interest in Europe, in European security architecture, and its strength is in its alliances. This is bearing on that. But I suggest for us today to think of concrete consequences of actions and inactions. So to leave aside the ideological questions and try to think what to make of this crisis and what could be some of the repercussions of doing something or nothing, right? It is easy to look at the Ukraine conflict so far, or it has been before the recent escalation, as just a regional conflict, right? Something there's quite a few casualties, mostly incurred in the war in 2014, 2015 between Ukraine and Russia, about 14,000 dead, injured. There's internally displaced people. There's economic and political costs, mostly to Ukraine and to Russia as a result of the sanctions that were imposed. But the rest of the European continent has sort of remain unscathed by this. There is a different way of looking at the possible repercussions, kind of from a broader international political and security implications. It's the seizure of Crimea, the illegal annexation of Crimea is a bad precedent of a breach of the UN Charter and OSCE Helsinki Final Act. There is a brewing interstate conflict in Europe. There's always a risk of escalation and things getting worse as they are now. And that is an inherently unstable situation. There is another consequence, and that is something I would like to focus on today. And that is the impact of the breach of the so-called Budapest Memorandum on security assurances to Ukraine in connection with its accession to the NPT that were pledged. These security assurances were pledged to Ukraine in 1994 as part, not whole, but part of the deal to convince Ukraine to give up its Soviet nuclear legacy, the nuclear weapons that it inherited from the Soviet Union. So here's the kind of main outlines of what exactly this Budapest Memorandum was. The first, the issue of security guarantees, which is something Ukrainians wanted and demanded or tried to pursue in negotiations, mostly with the United States, but then also, by extension with Russia. That issue first arose in the spring of 1992. And following that, there was a demand explicitly made in a law by the Ukrainian parliament. And it sent Ukrainian foreign ministry on negotiating these security assurances. Ukrainian diplomats soon found out that clearly, even though the security guarantees, so-called, were asked of nuclear states, right? They were in connection with Ukraine's accession to the NPT. It was implicit that Ukrainians wanted American guarantees, Western guarantees, against what they perceived a growing Russian threat of border revisionism, because Crimea was already coming online as a problem of separatism, but also of the former Soviet Black Sea Fleet base, which, the division of which became a very divisive issue. But the Ukrainians soon learned, and I'm sure Ambassador Pifer will focus in more detail on that the United States at the time was not willing or able to undertake any additional security commitments and obligations in relation to Ukraine, which was a new country that just came online, was formerly part of the Union. So this compromise solution was to have not a legally binding treaty, but a memorandum of understanding, a political document, although signed on the highest level by the presidents of Ukraine and the three NPT depository states, the United Kingdom, United States, and Russia, that essentially reiterated and reasserted certain commitments that were already contained in other multilateral documents, such as the UN Charter, right, to refrain from the use of threat of force, to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity per OSCE Helsinki Final Act, to refrain from economic coercion, something Ukrainians insisted on, including in view of their dependence on Russian energy supplies that were also becoming a political lever at the time. And also it reiterated the negative and positive NPT-related security assurances. That is, security assurances pledged by NPT nuclear weapon states to all NPT non-nuclear weapon state parties, not to threaten non-nuclear states with nuclear weapons, and should or use them against non-nuclear states, and seek UN Security Council action should such threats obtain. The only new thing or different thing about this memorandum was the inclusion of a consultation mechanism. That is, parties agreed that should issues arising from this memorandum take place, they will convene a meeting and consult. So, there we go. So the Budapest Memorandum did not provide legally binding security guarantees per se. They did not specify consequences for the breach of the obligations pledged. And most importantly, they did not provide a robust solution for Ukraine's security predicament. And I'll touch upon that later. However, as much as there's skepticism about this document, especially in Ukraine right now after 2014, the Budapest Memorandum did do a lot and was a significant document in these following ways. It basically grounded Ukraine in the sphere of US interests, right? What was communicated to Ukraine that it is now part of consideration for the United States. It's not an insignificant country. It could have provided a foundation for building further US-Ukrainian, Western Ukrainian security cooperation, had it perhaps been taken better advantage of in the peaceful years. And most importantly, sort of from my standpoint and the research that I have conducted, it became a constitutive part of the International Non-Proliferation Agreement regime, because no other country other than Ukraine, and also by extension Belarus and Kazakhstan, joined the NPT with this specific addendum, as it were. This document is now registered at the UN. It is part of the UN sort of legal political body of norms, as it were. So anything happening in connection with this memorandum, and specifically its breach, has ramifications for the broader non-proliferation regime. So as I mentioned, the Budapest Memorandum, perhaps, or the negotiations and the conclusion of this memorandum was perhaps a window of opportunity to address Ukraine's security predicament, right? Ukraine's security perceptions and interests and woes became part of the process of negotiations. They came to the fore, right? Even though kind of a sustainable solution was very difficult to find, legitimately difficult to find at the time. With Ukraine's disarmament, Russia, luckily for the broader international community, emerged as the sole nuclear successor of the USSR. So this potentially huge wave of proliferation to Ukraine, but who knows, maybe Kazakhstan and Belarus, if Ukraine set the example, was prevented. And that was, you know, by any account, especially for all of us who are interested in international peace and security and non-proliferation, this was a very fortunate and very lucky outcome. However, it had a nefarious side effect that by this sole successorship in the nuclear realm, somehow this perception that Russia is equivalent to the USSR, and perhaps some of the Russian security rationale would continue in the vein of the USSR. That has been allowed to kind of exist and pertain further in the world, these kind of narratives. So this 1994 settlement in Ukraine essentially left the country in a power vacuum, right? With, you know, certain options that Ukraine and could have sort of considered for itself, as it were. First was this guaranteed neutrality or self-sufficiency and non-alignment, which in all honesty, was Ukraine's original intention. The country did not aspire NATO membership in those years. And in fact, Ukrainian president at the time perceived that as perceived the announcement of NATO expansion as a threat to Ukraine, not because NATO was threatening, but precisely because it then wedged Ukraine between the expanded NATO and potentially revanchist Russia, without kind of covering that security and power vacuum in any other way. And in the archival documents that I consulted at the time, Ukrainians actually did bring the precedent, bring up the precedent of the Austrian state treaty, something that has popped up as a possibility for Ukraine right now. So this sort of guaranteed neutrality for the state. But at the time, sort of getting to Ukraine to denuclearize without having to go the extra mile in kind of thinking about more creative solutions of addressing these questions was possible. It came at rather intensive, but really quite a low cost to the West and to Russia to achieve that outcome. There was an idea of a regional arrangement, so the Baltic Black Sea corridor, but that was an idea that died a very quick and quiet death, given that most of Eastern European former Soviet bloc countries really had their eyes set on NATO and not on cooperating regionally with countries like Ukraine. Of course, there was always a possibility to integrate East into the Collective Security Treaty Organization, something that Belarus did eventually, and Kazakhstan. And there was a possibility to integrate West in some way or form, whether it's formal NATO membership or otherwise kind of Euro-Atlantic structures. I suppose as historians, we know that how tricky it is to engage with counterfactuals. But I'd like to put it out there that perhaps that time might have been the time to do Ukraine's neutrality properly. at this point, especially post 2014, the calls that we hear for that, at least from the Ukrainian standpoint, are a little, too late, right? Simply because Ukrainians have learned the hard way that their neighbor to the east might not be able to respect the kind of political arrangements that were agreed upon, and that to guarantee that neutrality, somebody has to put forward some kind of robust guarantees, the kind they sought in 1994 and the kind they did not receive. So all of this situation perceptionally is very unfortunate in Ukraine. As you can see, there's a poster that appeared sometime around 2014 on Ukraine's main square, the Independence Square in Kiev, where you see 3 toilet rolls, and it's pretty self-explanatory. The narrative that's set in, specifically in Ukraine, is that the Budapest Memorandum, because it imposed no costs on its breach, was kind of a worthless piece of paper, and Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons for nothing. I mean, I'm hoping that with my book, I might be able to convince and somehow shift that perception otherwise, to actually say that Ukraine did get a fair deal, all things considered, and that the breach of the Budapest Memorandum does not invalidate that decision. But even someone like Boris Tarasuk, at the time, who was a deputy foreign minister and a counterpart to Ambassador Pifer on the Ukrainian side in negotiating the memorandum, he thought that not only Russia violated these obligations, but the Western reaction did not live up, if not to the letter, then certainly to the spirit of the Budapest Memorandum. And even until today, as we see, as the Russian troops were amassing in the springtime at the Ukrainian borders, there was the statement by Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Andriy Melnik, who said that Ukraine might reconsider its nuclear decisions if its security is not provided for in some other way. Now, whether that is, Ukrainian foreign ministry then walked back that comment, and certainly I don't think we should fear that Ukraine would rearm, because it needs Western support a lot more than it could afford to defy the West. But it's a really unfortunate narrative that might, and this is sort of my last slide, that might have quite unfortunate repercussions for the credibility of the international non-proliferation regime viewed broadly. This regime, NPT-centered regime, it's a seminal treaty. It's done a lot of good in the world, in the view of a lot of people. It's going through really rough times, right? The tensions between the nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots are probably at a historical high. There's a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that is now in force. The NPT Revcom has been postponed once again, but the prospects for that to be a successful conference were rather low in the prediction of many of us dealing with the non-proliferation issue. There's also, with the rising tension between the nuclear states, recognized nuclear states, there's a continued issue of the fulfillment of Article 6 under the NPT, which is progress in arms control. And clearly, when the two states are in such loggerheads, it's very difficult to conduct successful arms control negotiations. So I will put it out there that the breach of the Budapest Memorandum, it might not be as obvious today, because perhaps today's proliferators might not be taking heed of Russian violations as much, but it generally affects and undermines the credibility of the entire NPT regime by saying that, if you disarm, no harm will come to you. and that and with that, I will hand it off to Ambassador Pifer. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for including on this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Budapest Memorandum and the current crisis. But let me just begin by recalling the key commitments that the United States, Russia, and Britain made in that document. Is they committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. They committed not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine. And they committed also not to use economic coercion against Ukraine. Now, I think if you look at the relationship between Kyiv and Moscow from the early 1990s up until about 2010, it was bumpy at times, but it was still largely manageable. But still, many would argue in Ukraine that, in fact, Russia violated the Budapest Memorandum well before 2014. So, for example, in the late 1990s, when I served in Kyiv, what I heard from Ukrainians, now they didn't raise it as a violation, but they did say that, look, we're getting economic pressure, economic coercion from Russia. Although nominally Ukraine and Russia were in a free trade area, they were saying that 300 of their major export products were actually exempt from free trade status in Russia. And they saw that very much as economic pressure, just as they saw the way that the Russians over the years managed the issue of the sale of natural gas to Ukraine. And I think if you look at the period, there are a number of cases where it was not just an economic dispute, but you saw the Russians using that in a political way. You also had in 2003 the episode of Tuzla Island. I think when most of us heard about that, we were scrambling for our atlases. Tuzla Island used to be, it's in the Kerch Strait. It used to be physically connected to the Russian mainland. And then the connection was severed in a storm back in the 1920s, but administratively, Tuzla had been treated as part of Crimea. And what happened is the Russians began building a levee from the Russian mainland out to Tuzla Island without telling the Ukrainians about this. And I recall one very interesting photo where you saw at the end of the levee, there were a couple of Russian dump trucks dumping more rocks into the water to extend the levee. And about 150 meters away, there was a barge with a Ukrainian dredge that was dredging the channel deeper to make the Russians have to bring more rocks. But the odd thing to me was, even though I thought this was a threat to Ukrainian territorial integrity, is Kyiv never invoked the Budapest Memorandum. They never came to us and said it. When we looked at it in the US government, the decision was made, a decision that I personally did not agree with, was that we should stay out of this politically, at least at first. Although I did find a time to communicate to the Russian ambassador, not as a political judgment, but as an analytical judgment that if asked, the United States would have to say that we regarded Tuzla as Ukrainian territory. And then, of course, in 2014, I think we saw a clear, undisputed violation of the Budapest Memorandum when the Russians used military force to seize Crimea and then subsequently annexed it. And then after that, after Crimea, the Ukrainian government did invoke this clause that Mariana mentioned, that there is a right to convene a meeting of the signatories to the Budapest Memorandum. And so they asked for a meeting of foreign ministers. The American, British, and Ukrainian foreign ministers showed up. Sergei Lavrov boycotted it. And he offered one of the most bizarre things I've ever heard in international law. He said, "We are not bound by the Budapest Memorandum because we did not conclude this memorandum with this government in Kyiv." And international agreements are not concluded between governments, they're concluded between states. And there's a reason for that. If you accepted and applied Mr. Lavrov's rationale broadly, anytime a government changed. So when we went from President Trump to President Biden, the United States would have to re-sign every agreement that had been signed in the 200 years of history. Totally bizarre, but that's sometimes what you hear from Moscow. And then, of course, after Crimea, you saw the Russians instigate and sustain a conflict in Donbass. Now, originally that was portrayed as a separatist conflict. I think the people that are fighting in Donbass now, in occupied Donbass, are more properly classified as Russian and Russian proxy forces, because it was very clear that leadership, money, heavy weapons, ammunition, and other supplies were coming from Russia. And at several instances in the battles of Ilovaisk and Debaltseve in 2015, regular units of the Russian army entered Ukraine to take up the fight. And there have been real costs. 14,000 people have died in Donbass. 1.5 million people have left the area, and huge material losses. But what the Russians then did was they kept this conflict in Donbass simmering. And in contrast to Crimea, which they quickly annexed, I think they see Donbass, or they saw Donbass, as a mechanism to put pressure on the government in Kyiv, to distract, to destabilize it, and they had the ability to ratchet the pressure up or ratchet it down. And now we're seeing that they're ratcheting the pressure way up, and not just in Donbass. Mariana's table from 2020 showed, I think it was about 28 battalion tactical groups near Ukraine. The reporting now is that there are either units or equipment still waiting to be manned for about 60 battalion tactical groups, and the potential for 100,000 troops. I think there was one estimate as many as 175,000. The Russians are bringing in ground forces from as far away as the Far East Military District, which means they're coming 3,000 and 4,000 miles. There are reserve call-ups. The deployments that began last week to Belarus, I think, are worrisome from two angles, both because that would open up a new attack corridor into Ukraine, but that also brings Russian forces closer to countries such as Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, all NATO members. But what the Russians have done is, I think, create major military operations for Russia, should the Kremlin choose to use against Ukraine. Now, Mariana just addressed the question, why should the United States care in the debate between realists and liberal nationalists? Let me say, I say we should care because of the Budapest Memorandum. We should take it seriously. It was not a legally binding document, but it does have the signature of the United States president. And it was a key part of the arrangement with Ukraine that was negotiated trilaterally between Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow, under which Ukraine gave up 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads and their delivery means. And if you go back to the 1990s, when you looked at the post-Soviet space, that's in the top 1 or 2 objectives for US policy. I think at one time I did a calculation, those warheads could have destroyed every American city with a population more than 50,000, 3 times over. And that mattered to the United States at the time. Now, some argue that the United States has actually met its obligations under the Budapest Memorandum. We have not invaded Ukraine. We try to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We've not used economic coercion. And I think that's a very narrow interpretation of the Budapest Memorandum. And I thoroughly disagree with it. And I've debated with some of my think tank colleagues on this in the past. Because in negotiating the memorandum, there were things said to the Ukrainians. And it was not just also the Budapest Memorandum, but its antecedent, which was the trilateral statement. And if you go back to the January 1994 trilateral statement signed in Moscow, that actually says, here's the language in the Budapest Memorandum. This will be signed once Ukraine accedes to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. But in doing that, there was lots of conversations with the Ukrainians. We had a very big discussion on whether it would be a memorandum on assurances and guarantees. Now, if the American view was, this doesn't matter as long as we don't invade Ukraine, we didn't need to have that conversation. But the reason we told the Ukrainians it was a memorandum of assurances and not guarantees, because guarantees to American ears applies a military commitment. NATO allies have a guarantee. Japan, South Korea, Australia have a military guarantee. But neither the George H.W. Bush administration nor the Clinton administration were prepared to extend a military guarantee to Ukraine. So it was assurances. And what we said to the Ukrainians at the time was, look, we're not going to commit military force if there's a violation, but we are going to take an interest. We are going to take a strong interest in Ukraine. And there will be things that will happen if the memorandum is violated. Now, what we did not do in 1993 and 1994 is we did not get into a detailed discussion with the Ukrainians as to what exactly we would do depending on what the Russian violation was. And I think that was in part a failure, both a failure in Washington, but also a failure in Ukraine, is we collectively failed to foresee Vladimir Putin and what he would do in 2014. At the time you were dealing with Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin had many flaws, but he was very steady on the idea that Ukraine was an independent state and that he accepted Ukraine in the borders as of 1991. And I might suppose that had the Ukrainian side actually foreseen what would have happened in 2014, I'm not sure where the negotiation would have gone and what would have been the price to get Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons, if there was a price that the United States was prepared to pay. So I think you can debate whether the United States has done enough or not for Ukraine. I was actually critical of the Obama administration in 2014 on two counts. First of all, to explain the support for Ukraine, they never really cited the Budapest Memorandum. And I think that answers the question that I often get, well, why do we care about Ukraine? It's 5,000 miles away. And I said, well, if you go back to the Budapest Memorandum, we told the Ukrainians that we would care, and that was in return for the Ukraine doing something that was very important to American national security, which was eliminating the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. The second thing, the Obama administration, I think that they should have done more, particularly in the area of military assistance. And a group of us tried and failed to persuade the Obama administration to provide lethal military assistance. But I would argue that, since 2014, you've actually seen a ratcheting up of American support. And even under the Trump administration, set aside President Trump, but the administration actually pursued a fairly good policy and got to the point of providing Ukraine lethal military assistance. Now, I'm not sure the president fully supported or even understood his policy, but it was going in a very different direction from the way he spoke about his relation or his desire for relations with Russia. And then the Biden administration has built on that. And in the current crisis, while the Biden administration has made clear they will not send American troops to Ukraine, Ukraine does not have a US guarantee, but they've offered strong political support. They've offered military assistance, $2.5 billion and climbing since 2014. And I think in the last 12 months, it's about $650 million. And there was just a delivery, I think this morning, of an additional set of supplies, including 300 more Javelin anti-armor missiles. There's training, there's 200 US troops in Ukraine now. Now they're in Yavoriv, which is about as far west as you can be in Ukraine and still be in Ukraine. So they're on the other side from the conflict, but they've been training Ukrainian forces now for about 4 or 5 years. The United States has done a lot of work with allies on sanctions, and the sanctions that particularly applied by the European Union have held much longer than I think we would have expected. Had you told people working on Ukraine back in 2014 that EU sanctions would be still applied on Russia in 2022 and would in fact have been strengthened, I think most of us would have been surprised. And then also, I think you've seen a very intense effort, particularly in the last 2 months by the United States, to marshal allied support for Ukraine. So in the current crisis, the Biden administration, they have this two-track approach. They would like to see a diplomatic path out of it, but they're also trying to do everything they can to persuade Moscow that there will be real costs to Russian military action against Ukraine. And this goes back to the video conference between Presidents Biden and Putin on December 7th. And those punishments fall into 3 areas: new sanctions. If we're on a scale of 1 to 10, on sanctions on Russia, we're probably now at about a 3. There's a lot more that could be done, and it sounds like the administration is working hard to fill out that list. And yesterday, White House officials on background said that the plan would be, if the Russians use military force, it would not be gradual application of sanctions. They would get hit with everything at once. Second thing is more military assistance to Ukraine. And then third would be steps to bolster NATO's military presence on its eastern flank. Because if the Russians use military force, you can expect countries such as the Baltic states, Poland, and Romania to become more nervous. And the US government has basically said, we will respond to that. And I would note that you're actually seeing some proactive movement. The military assistance numbers have been increased, not waiting for a Russian invasion. And you probably saw that the day before yesterday, 8,500 US troops were put on alert. And I think the idea here is that NATO is looking at whether the NATO response force should be activated, and then some portion of that force be deployed to the Baltic states, Poland, and Romania, basically to offer some assurance to those countries, but also to signal the Russians that while it's pretty clear the United States and NATO will not intervene in Ukraine to defend Ukraine, that would not be the case with NATO territory. And at the same time, I think there is this effort to try to find an extended diplomatic search, but it's also pretty clear that the West is not prepared to sacrifice principles. So the West has made clear it's not going to agree to forswear further NATO enlargement, even though NATO enlargement for Ukraine is not an immediate issue. They're not going to agree to withdraw forces from NATO allies that joined the alliance after 1997. They're not going to agree to suspend all military contacts with countries such as Ukraine. And plus, they're also going to say that, look, Ukraine is an independent state as recognized, including by Moscow in the Helsinki Final Act. Ukraine should have a right to determine its own course. At the same time, looking at the two draft treaties that the Russians proposed back in December, I think the Biden administration and NATO tried to say there are elements in here that we in fact could negotiate on. Arms control regarding missiles, which Putin has expressed a concern about, confidence and security building measures, risk reduction measures. So there are some things there that could actually be a basis for a real conversation that might address some of the real Russian concerns about NATO military activities, but without getting into some of these broader demands that the Russians have made. The problem I see is that the Russians have been hearing that now for almost 2.5 weeks. I believe this week, the United States and NATO plan to deliver written responses to the Russian draft treaties. In fact, I think Ambassador Sullivan may have delivered one already this morning, the US response. But my concern is that as the Russians have heard from Deputy Secretary Sherman, from the NATO-Russia meeting, and then last week from Secretary Blinken, that there's a readiness to negotiate on these arms control, CSBMs, and risk reduction measures. There's not a readiness to meet things like a pledge not to enlarge NATO further. The problem is the Russians keep saying those are the main demands, that their key demands are being ignored. And I do agree, I very much hope, as with Mariana, that this will not lead to war. But I have to say in the last couple of months, I've become more pessimistic that the Kremlin seems to be painting itself into a corner where it may have a little choice other than some kind of military conflict. So why don't I stop there and turn it back to you, Matt.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Steve. So I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and ask a couple of questions. And while we're discussing those in the audience, you can ask questions by raising your hand or putting them in the, I don't know on your screens whether it's a chat or a Q&A function. On my screen, it's a chat. So let me start with sort of the last point Steve was raising, which is diplomatic resolutions. John Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, said that the lesson is always give your adversary a face-saving way to back down. And the question is there a set of things that NATO or the United States could plausibly agree to that, or perhaps progress on implementation of Minsk Accords as one of them, that might allow, even though it didn't include some of the key Russian demands, might allow Putin to say, see, look at what I got for Russian security. The Americans are finally listening to us. Is there a path forward of that nature? And does it look like any of the Russians are looking for that at the moment?
Yeah, Matt, I think your last comment touched on it exactly. I think there is a path forward. You could build on, again, extracting elements of the Russian draft US-Russia treaty and the Russian proposed NATO-Russia agreement. You could extract elements and have a conversation on strike systems, on missiles. I mean, Putin at one point was talking about American missiles in Ukraine. I think he's about the only person in the world who's talking about that. But yeah, I mean, I would be prepared to give up a plan that the United States does not have to not deploy missiles that the United States has not yet built. That's not a really hard one. And again, I think there are a number of confidence and security building measures, limits on the scope and scale of exercises. You might even get into, do you want to limit the size of exercises in certain areas, provided it's reciprocal? So there's actually a pretty rich menu of things that could be done that could address real security concerns on conventional arms control. But what I don't know is, and at least from the signals from Moscow, that does not seem to be enough for the Russians. Now on Minsk, the problem with Minsk, I think, is that a lot of the terms and the provisions there are not fully defined. And the one that's most problematic to my mind is the agreement that Donbass will have, quote, special status, some degree of autonomy. Now, I can come up with a number of things that you could do to give Donbass autonomy over things like health matters, education matters, local police forces. But what I suspect what the Russians want, and we've seen an example, it goes back to Dmitry Kozak, who is now the Kremlin lead person on Ukraine. Back in 2003, he was the lead person on Moldova and Transnistria. And he came up with something called the CISAC Memorandum that was designed to be the solution for reintegrating Transnistria into Moldova. And Moldova didn't accept it in the end. And I thought that was a wise decision by the Moldovans, because it would have given Transnistria not only autonomy over local issues, but the ability to veto national level policy. So if that's the Russian plan on special status, I don't see how Kyiv can accept that. So I tend to be a little bit pessimistic. The big question, I think, for the Russians on Ukraine is Ukraine and NATO. And the best I could come up with about 4 years ago in a track 2 conversation with Ukrainians and Russians would be to say, Ukraine and NATO, not now, but not never. What I don't know is how you go beyond that and to actually put that into words without looking like you were compromising a position of principle for NATO. And bear in mind that if you wanted, even if the United States said, we want to close NATO's open door, NATO policy is made by consensus. So you would have to persuade 29 allies to agree to that. And from what I can tell, there are few, if any, allies who are prepared to close the open door. So you're not going to get a consensus. And moreover, they're getting a little bit of pressure from the outside. I think in the last 3 weeks, both the Finns and the Swedes have said, we are not applying to join NATO, but we do want NATO to keep its door open.
Well, but you will also need a consensus to add a new member. And I think at this point, the odds of there being a consensus for Ukraine to join strike me as small. Mariana, do you want to say anything about ways out of the current crisis?
So one of the things I have been contemplating as perhaps a productive way forward, and also something that could offer the Russian side a diplomatic win, as it were, is to broaden the Normandy format to include the United States and the United Kingdom, to sort of create, quote unquote, Budapest format. So this way, the United States would be brought to the table to engage on the issues with Russia, and perhaps revise these agreements, or work as it did actually in the nuclear disarmament process in the early 90s, because the United States and the Clinton administration came into kind of more actively in the process of negotiating the actual kind of nuclear deal, especially the compensation for fissile material contained in Ukraine's nuclear warheads, when the Ukrainian-Russian negotiations came to a standstill. They came to a dead end. And this was a new Bill Clinton kind of revamped policy of kind of mediating between the two sides that couldn't agree. So perhaps a more active American involvement with the nod to the Budapest Memorandum that, again, so far has been made, as Ambassador Pifer pointed out, very little use of politically, could be one of the solutions.
It's an interesting thought. So we have a lot of audience questions, but I am nonetheless going to ask one more because I think it's important to start thinking farther ahead. Let's imagine that military action does take place, and that the United States and European countries do impose severe sanctions, and Russia takes whatever response actions to that it chooses to take. How does that affect US-Russian relations for years to come after that? And how does that then affect nuclear risks? And are we doing any planning to get out of that deep freeze if, in fact, we do get into it? Either of you want to take that on? Mariana?
I'll defer to Steve on that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think if there is Russian military action against Ukraine, it's going to take a relationship which, ironically, after the Geneva meeting last year between Presidents Biden and Putin, there were some positive things. I mean, it
was getting better.
Yeah, I wouldn't say wildly better, but you could say, hey, this is at least moving slowly in the right direction. Of course, that's now been wiped out by Ukraine. And if the Russians do go into Ukraine, my guess is, it's going to go plunge the relationship even lower. One thing I worry about from the arms control side, on the US-Russia side, is I would argue that we need to have arms control now more than ever to try to contain the aspects of relationship which is becoming increasingly adversarial. But I suspect the Russian military invasion into Ukraine is going to put those things on hold in the same way that what the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact did to Czechoslovakia back in 1968 set back the beginning of the SALT negotiations. And part of this,
I hope it is in the same way, in that, in a certain sense, that was brief. My fear is that this may be long lasting.
Yeah, but part of this too, though, from the point of view of the Budapest Memorandum, in a way, I think it's actually, to the extent that the United States imposes real costs on Russia, I think that's useful. Because right now, and it gets to Mariana's point about what the Russian violation of Budapest does to the ability to use security assurances as a tool to address future non-proliferation cases. There was an effort, I think, back in the 1990s with North Korea to say part of the package would be some American, quote, security assurances to North Korea. And right now, if you had a North Korean diplomat ask a Ukrainian counterpart, how'd the Budapest Memorandum work out? I don't want to have them say, well, yeah, we signed it, we gave away all these nuclear weapons, and then the Russians invaded us. I would prefer them to say, well, we signed it, we gave away the nuclear weapons, the Russians invaded us, but the Americans and the British really worked hard to make the Russians pay. Otherwise, I think we are going to see a devaluation of security assurances as a future item in the toolkit for dealing with proliferation concerns.
All right. I see quite a queue, but I also see that Sergei Rogov is among those with his hands up. And since we haven't had a Russian point of view in this session, I'm going to jump the queue a little bit and turn to Sergei for his question.
Thank you, Matt, but I don't want to jump the queue since there are quite a few people who raise their hands before me, and okay. I can wait and then retaliate.
All right. All right. Heather, I'll have you up first.
Thanks. And thanks a lot, Steve and Mariana. This was really fascinating and just learned so much. I have a question for each of you, if that's okay. So Steve, Secretary Blinken has said that there is, quote unquote, no daylight between the United States and its allies on Ukraine. I was kind of just curious about your reaction to that, particularly as as a Europe watcher. It seems like Germany and France might have a slightly different take on it, but also just in recent days, we've seen Ukraine itself has come out with a different intelligence assessment from the US in terms of the likelihood of invasion. So yeah, just curious, do you see some daylight between the US and its allies, including between the US and Ukraine? And to Mariana, this might be a bit more of an anecdotal question, but I was just kind of curious if you could share what are some public attitudes or public opinion going on within Ukraine right now? Because in the past, we've seen Russia kind of use the Ukrainian public as a premise for its intervention, its involvement, and saying, oh, we're here to protect Russian speakers. Is there support for that within Ukraine? Do you think it's more widespread now than it would have been in 2014? Is it less widespread? I'm really just curious about what you're hearing from people on the ground there. But thanks again, both so much. This is really great.
Steve?
Okay, well, on the daylight question, let me start with Ukraine. No, I think it is clear that there's a different intelligence assessment between the United States and Ukraine. Part of the Ukrainian assessment may be in part, though, that they're trying to avoid panic. I kind of composed a list of indicators, things I would watch for on the military side and the political side about a week ago, and one was what happens to the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. Drawing down an embassy is a very disruptive action. And so I took the decision that was announced on Sunday that the embassy went on ordered departure for dependents and authorized departure or voluntary departure for non-essential staff as reflecting a US judgment that Russian military action is a significant possibility. A judgment by the US that it would not be limited just to Donbass. I mean, Donbass is 300 miles away from Kyiv. So the fact that they're bringing people out of Kyiv suggests that they think it could be a much wider geographic engagement. And third, that there's a certain degree of urgency. Now, the urgency is tempered by the fact that State Department policy is if you're going to draw down, you want to draw down early in the crisis, particularly when you have commercial air. It's much easier to get people out when you have Lufthansa and Austrian and British Airways flying in. So there's that thing there. But I think that's it's reflects a judgment that I've heard reflected privately over the last month and a half by US government officials, that they think that there's a very real possibility the Russians will use military force. I think that would be a mistake, but by the Russians, but that is the judgment. On the question of daylight with allies, I mean, what US officials say is, yeah, we're lined up in sync with our allies, and they're going to say that. And my sense is that on sort of big issues, we probably are aligned. You know, the differences may emerge if the Russians actually go in, and then you see, are there differences over particular sanctions? With the Germans case, though, it's been interesting to me to watch that Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that is now completed from Germany under the Baltic Sea to Germany, and which the Germans have always described as a commercial product. There's been an evolution in the way Chancellor Scholz talks about it. And he's basically, I think, come out to say, look, if the Russians use military force against Ukraine, you can't isolate Nord Stream 2 from that. Secretary Blinken has said, if the Russians use military force against Ukraine, no gas will move through Nord Stream 2. And my interpretation of that is there's an expectation in Washington that either the Germans will shut it down, and if not, you will not see a repetition of the waivers that the administration issued last May on sanctions, and the administration will sanction Nord Stream 2 to death.
Heather, thank you for the question. I would just like to offer a comment about Ukrainian government sort of walking back on the prospects of invasion. I think Steve is correct that they're trying to contain the panic, but also what they're walking back or they're mitigating is the narrative that a full-scale offensive, that it's going to take all of Ukraine till Dnieper and capture Kyiv and whole territory. That is the least likely scenario in the analyses of Ukrainian defense analysts and probably Ukrainian kind of security and leadership. What they're not saying that no military kind of incursion, that they're dismissing that as a sort of any possibility of military incursion. And there's certainly things that the Russian military forces at the current levels, 100-some thousand, could do in a very damaging way, destroyed Ukrainian armed forces with superior air power and ground firepower that Russia dominates in. They can come in, take a bunch of prisoners of war and use it as leverage. So, short of kind of invading and holding large parts of Ukrainian territory that, the Russians probably know will be costly because the local resistance will be robust. And that gets to Heather's question. Ukrainian kind of public support for NATO membership has been quite lukewarm until 2014. So one of the, as any country, there's many different regions that had they had different histories that came together in Ukraine. This is not unique to Ukraine. I mean, I think Russians tried to present it as a very much divided country and an artificial construct, but look at what's going on in this country between the South and the North, right? Between the coast and the Midwest. Every country has its own divisions. The point is, how do you kind of that accommodates some of these differences and still makes for a good and democratic country. So ironically, and I'm not sure if Mr. Putin's kind of calculations foresaw that, the Russian invasion united Ukraine more than Ukraine has now ever been united before. And I mean, most of Ukraine, probably the majority of Ukraine, Ukrainian population has been Russian speaking. Kyiv is essentially a Russian speaking city. If you go there on the street, what you hear is Russian, but that in no way somehow indicates that people are in support of Russian policies towards Ukraine, or Ukraine is becoming more bilingual right now. But still, most of the Maidan in 2014, if you went to the Maidan, the language was Russian. The language in the Ukrainian trenches is Russian. So language is a really quite poor proxy, and language has been kind of one of the tools or pretexts that the Russians used as to trying to protect Russian-speaking population in Ukraine. But most of the Russian-speaking population certainly doesn't need that kind of protection. It seems to me, I was just in Ukraine. I'm from Western Ukraine. I was just in Ukraine for the holidays, for New Year's, and for Ukrainian Christmas. And I was struck by the general calm. And part of that calm is because Ukraine has already been fighting a war for 8 years, right? There is that, not a level of comfort, but there is a certain preparedness, psychological preparedness that things could escalate. And, all the best you can do is to be prepared the best you can to it. And there's a quite a high level of morale. And I think, sociological surveys do show that Ukrainians will take up arms and put up quite a severe resistance to any occupation. Thank you.
Ambassador Graham, I have you on my list next. Good to see you. You need to unmute yourself.
Matt, thank you for calling on me. And I just want to say that there's been a lot of very interesting presentations today. And I would just like to make a comment on something that was discussed earlier, as opposed to getting into right now anyway, policy toward the situation in Ukraine. I would argue that unquestionably, without the shadow of a doubt, the Budapest Memorandum is legally binding and part of the NPT regime. And to breach that is the equivalent of breaking a provision of the NPT regime. There's the World Court has ruled on a number of occasions that where statements are made and something is done to the country making the statement of benefit to that country. In other words, benefits are exchanged, a statement made and weapons transferred or whatever it be, is legally binding under international law. And it certainly is part of the general settlement of indefinite extension and the NPT and bringing in the other states left after the Soviet Union and so forth. So there's no doubt about that. And I think that whereas a Russian invasion, should it happen, would be a serious problem for NATO. I'm skeptical that sanctions will have much effect on Russian behavior, but how that will go, we'll have to see. But that they are breaking with a legally binding part of the NPT regime, I think is without doubt.
Either Steve or Mariana have anything to say to that, or should I move on to our next questioner? Okay, John Aldrin.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thanks to Ambassador Pifer and Mariana for those very instructive presentations. One of the points that Mariana made was the importance of understanding that Russia does not equal the USSR. And that was certainly particularly important to recognize right after the Soviet Union broke up. I think it could be argued that the United States chose to act as if Russia was equivalent to the USSR by insisting not only that NATO be continued, but that it be expanded. Clearly, NATO had been created as a bulwark against the USSR, and the immediate response of the United States, or nearly immediate response to the breakup of the USSR, was to insist with its NATO allies that NATO was still absolutely essential and would need to be made even bigger. I think that the United States and its NATO allies could have said at that time that if the neutrality and non-alignment of new and existing states on the boundary of Russia were threatened by Russia, then and only then would the question of the accession of such countries to NATO arise. That's not what we did. I don't know if any version of that could be resurrected today to say, look, the Budapest Agreement, as I understand it, and I think as Mariana presented it, made a big point of Ukrainian neutrality and non-alignment. And if Matt's shaking his head, maybe he hates my whole argument, or just the point that neutrality and non-alignment were part of the Budapest Agreement. But in any case, it seems to me that while Putin may have painted himself into a corner, I believe the United States has also painted itself into a corner by, again, insisting that without any conditions, the door to expansion of NATO remains forever open to everybody.
If I could take that on really quickly, and thank you so much, Ambassador Graham, for your input on the kind of legally binding nature of these commitments. The Budapest Memorandum does not contain any provisions of Ukrainian neutrality. Ukraine had declared itself, as when it kind of pursued independence, that it wants to be a permanently non-aligned and neutral state. That was contained in the 1990 Declaration of Sovereignty. And that was already actually a radical move because at that point, Ukraine was part and parcel still of the Soviet military strategic space as one of the constituent republics. So actually the declaration of that neutrality was extremely significant. It said, we want to be cut off from that force. What I suppose Ukraine wanted to achieve or attempted to achieve with the Budapest Memorandum is something like that kind of guaranteed neutrality. It probably would have taken longer to negotiate, more kind of intricate types of considerations. You know, at that point, you know, a lot hung on Ukraine's accession to the NPT, including the coming into force of START 1. So there was a huge pressure to get this done quickly and to start implementing, you know, the START 1, but also START 2 was in the process of being negotiated. And that there was kind of this backlog of these huge arms control agreements that all kind of hung on this decision that Ukraine had to make. And I think perhaps it was done, you know, in retrospect, more could have been achieved in that moment in terms of, as you say, John, to say, all right, you know, Ukraine would be permanently neutral within this agreement unless its neutrality is breached by the one of the sides, and then it could, you know, consider NATO membership. Instead, you know, as we explained, there were things reiterated from other documents, very important ones, UN Charter, Helsinki Act, yet little new has been kind of added on to that.
Yeah, let me add a couple. I won't go through the whole debate about what happened in the 90s, but I do think that the Russians have tried to portray this crisis as mainly between NATO and Russia over expansion. But I guess I'd make a point. There are 5 NATO countries that border Russian territory, including the Kaliningrad exclave. All of those countries were in NATO or joined NATO in 2004. So in the last 18 years, no new country, the 4 member states that have joined since 2004 were all in the Balkans, 1,000 kilometers away from Russia. So if this is just about NATO enlargement, why didn't it happen in 2004 or 2008 or 2012? Again, I think this is mainly about Ukraine. I would also note that in 2014, Ukraine's policy under President Yanukovych, was not to seek membership in NATO, was not to seek a membership action plan. But you saw beginning the summer of 2013, huge pressure on him not to sign an association agreement with the European Union, something that senior Russian officials as recently, I think as 2009 or 2010 had said, they don't care about Ukraine's relationship with the EU. Well, something changed. And so it was pressure about the European Union. And I guess the last, and this circles back to a comment Mariana made a little bit earlier, if you look at the change in Ukrainian attitudes towards NATO, President Zelensky, when he came to office in 2019, I think was actually ambivalent about his country's relationship with NATO. He now sees it as essential for Ukraine's security. And I would argue that nothing has done more to push Ukraine out of Russia's orbit, to push Ukraine to institutions like NATO, than Russian policy over the last 8 years. Having territory seized by another country, having your territory occupied by another country, having 14,000 people killed in a conflict that's largely supported by another country is unlikely to win that country a lot of fans in Ukraine.
Mayumi, you're up next.
Thank you. This is really fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Ambassador Pifer and Mariana. So I have just a question about counterfactual. Counterfactual about what would have happened had Ukraine inherited nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union and had kept them on their soil since the 1990s. And I'd like to hear your thoughts from both of you on whether we would be seeing what we see today, like Russia amassing troops along the Ukrainian border, had Ukraine kept their nuclear weapons. And some IR scholars say Ukraine should have insisted on their operational control on nuclear weapons for their security, right? But on the other hand, I think that there is a IR argument called stability-instability paradox, and obviously there is a casual war between India and Pakistan in 1998. At the time, both already got nuclear weapons, and the Russians back in the 1960s, I guess 1969, Russians fought border wars with China. China already got nuclear weapons at the time, right? So even between nuclear armed Ukraine and the nuclear armed Russia, there, we could see some incursion or maybe small skirmishes along the border anyway, right? Given the geography surrounding Ukraine. Alternatively, you might say that, well, had Ukraine kept the nuclear weapons on their soil, and then Budapest Memorandum wouldn't exist today, then United States wouldn't provide any lethal military assistance to Ukraine. There wouldn't be obviously a discussion about NATO expansion to cover Ukraine. So Russia wouldn't feel threatened by the US military assistance to Ukraine. Therefore, Russia shouldn't be doing the military activities along the borderline. So I will hear how you would think about this counterfactual. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me take a first step at that. Thank you so much, Mayumi. And I first want to kind of set the record straight on what exactly Ukraine inherited. What Ukraine inherited was not a usable deterrent that it could have chosen to keep right there and then and sort of for the purposes of deterring Russia. It was a chunk of of a nuclear force of another country, the Soviet Union, namely, designed for entirely different strategic purpose, which is to deter the United States and NATO. The way I like to think of that inheritance as a really generous proliferator starter package, right? It could have used the know-how, the industrial, technical, scientific capacity that it had inherited from the Soviet Union to cobble together something like a deterrent down the road. So it would have taken money and it would have taken time. And money was something Ukraine didn't exactly have, nor did it want to sort of defy the international community and become another pariah state, right? Having said that, you know, one can sort of speculate what would happen if say, North Korea ended up with, you know, 176 ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles with 1,200 warheads and some cruise missiles and strategic bombers, where they, you know, the command and control was in Beijing, right? They would have probably been quite inventive in how to sort of take advantage of that. What I think Ukrainian, so the question was not whether nuclear Ukraine, you know, at that point per se would have been more secure, you know, in relation to Russia. Although I suppose if nuclear deterrence works for some other countries, it might have worked for Ukraine. The idea was that, you know, Ukraine did not become that kind of proliferation problem that would have sucked the international resources and its own resources. And it, in exchange, it sort of wanted those security, some kind of security solution for that predicament. Steve?
Yeah, let me add a couple points. I agree that the nuclear arsenal on Ukraine's territory, particularly after the tactical weapons were quickly withdrawn by the Russians, the strategic arsenal was not readily usable. But for example, the Ukrainians had access to the weapons that were in storage, the reserve strategic ballistic missile warheads and the warheads for the air-launched cruise missiles were maintained in storage sites that were solely under Ukrainian control. And I had this confirmed to me by retired senior Russian officers. So they had access, and I think they had the technical and engineering expertise. If they wanted to, they could have done it. I think they concluded on their own early on in 1992 that trying to maintain an independent deterrent would have been just too costly, because most of the infrastructure for supporting those nuclear weapons, and Soviet-era nuclear weapons tended to have relatively short shelf lives, most of that infrastructure was back in Russia. Now, the possibility, though, that Ukraine might keep nuclear weapons was I think, one of the reasons, if you look at Secretary Baker, why one of his goals was to have just one nuclear weapon state emerge from the wreckage of the Soviet Union. And that was, they were also very much watching what happened in Yugoslavia and saying, you know, if Russia does, you know, if the Russian breakup is as violent as Yugoslavia breakups, do you want to have competing nuclear powers in that space? But you know, had the Ukrainians, though, chose to keep the nuclear weapons, I think that there would have been real cost to Ukraine. There would have been no strategic partnership with the United States. You know, Leonid Kuchma would not be welcome once or twice a year in Washington, D.C. There would have been no relationship with NATO, no relationship with the European Union. I believe that whenever Ukraine applied to the IMF or World Bank for low interest credits, they would have been vetoed by the American and European executive directors. So I think there would have been very real political and economic costs to Ukraine. It might not have been quite the pariah that North Korea is, but it certainly would not be welcome in polite diplomatic company. And then had it ended up in a dispute with Russia, and you can say there were other issues that would cause tensions between Moscow and Kyiv. You know, how would we feel if you had the present crisis going if Ukraine had kept, you know, 45 or 50 nuclear weapons and managed to secure them and hide them in places where the Russians couldn't preempt? You know, I think as nervous as I am about the current crisis, I would be a whole lot more nervous in that circumstance.
I personally think also that we should not assume that Russia would have sat back and watched and done nothing as Ukraine took control of those nuclear weapons. I think there's at least a real potential that there would have been conflict over that.
And I think in that case, I'm not sure that Ukraine would have had much support from the outside world.
That's right.
I mean, a lot of people were saying, we're glad that Russia is sort of securing that.
But on that note, Sergei Rogov is next in line now.
Thank you, Matt. And I appreciate very much being at this very interesting discussion. And I'm happy to see so many familiar faces. And the topic which is being discussed is very important for me personally, because for a number of strange reasons, I was very much involved in the developments related to the Soviet nuclear weapons in early 90s. The situation was in my country really a complete chaos. In America, in the United States, there are pretty many strange things happening nowadays. But the Soviet Union was a failed state, and nobody was minding the store. Gorbachev and his team were completely powerless. Yeltsin and his team didn't care. And as a result, we faced a situation which Steve just mentioned, that the Soviet Union would collapse and there will be a civil war between many elements of the country because of the ethnic territorial disputes. And actually it did happen in places like Nagorno-Karabakh and some other places. And I was not a big guy. I was the chief of the department at our institute, but my main concern was to prevent a nuclear civil war if the Soviet Union collapses. And I was pleading to my colleagues and friends in the government, and they didn't listen. I had some friends in the US government, and in particular, Brent Scowcroft was very much open-minded. And Condi Rice used to take notes when I was talking to him that the main task is to make Russia the only successor of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. When the Belovezhskaya Pushcha happened, it was to me clear that Ukraine, which proclaimed its independence, will pretty soon move away from its declared position at the time of denuclearization because of Chernobyl's impact and neutrality. And I was concerned about, well, the growing nationalism in Ukraine. And at the same time, there were serious problems in Crimea and some other places related to the territory of the new independent states. And in February 1992, again, that was a very sudden development. I was with the Russian delegation at the second summit of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which took place in Minsk. And everybody was pretty much drunk. And when I was trying to talk to Kozyrev, who was then the foreign minister of Russia, and Grachev, that we should be very careful about the nuclear legacy, they didn't listen. And I was, in those days, a heavy smoker. I was not alone in though. And when I went out from the hall, And I came back, I asked Kozyrev, what document you signed? He said, well, that was the distribution of the Soviet armed forces, which that was the paper which announced that the Soviet military equipment and Soviet military forces on the territory of each independent state were the property of the new independent state. So that was the document which made 12 countries nuclear weapon states. I pleaded, as I said, to Grachev and to Kozyrev, and it was impossible. And then I did something terrible. Yeltsin, who was sitting in front of me, I came to him and said, Boris Nikolaevich, you just gave our nuclear weapons to 12 states. And he looked at me, and definitely he was very much drunk, and then took in his fist his pen and crossed his signature. Great. I took the paper and went to see Kravchuk and told him, Russia withdrew its signature. Why Ukraine keeps its signature? And then he also crossed the signature. Okay, Armenian and Azerbaijani presidents, and they were fighting at the time, when I loudly said that Russia and Ukraine withdrew their purposes, their signatures, they were arguing that they want to maintain the original text, which made them nuclear weapon states.
Sergey, I hate to interrupt this wonderful story. I note that we have 3 minutes left, and you should leave some time for them to respond. When you get
anyway, by an accident, it was avoided. And then the Lisbon Protocol made Ukraine, together with Belarus and Kazakhstan, successors to the START I treaty, which I thought was a mistake. But then the START II treaty was signed. It was the United States which helped to make Russia the only successor of the Soviet nuclear weapons. And nobody today in Russia gives credit to Americans for doing that. And just imagine what would have been the situation today if Ukraine was a nuclear weapon state. I frankly think Russia has no intention to invade Ukraine. But Russia wants to prevent a military solution by Ukraine of the Donbas problem. And if we are able somehow to reach an agreement between Russia and the United States and Russia and NATO, then the political solution of the Donbas problem will become possible. But also, as Steve said, we need to move forward with realistic arms control and confidence building measures. And definitely what happened 30 years ago was something which defined and settled the roots of the present conflict on the territory of the former Soviet Union.
Okay, we've only got a minute or so left. Steve and Mariana, last thoughts, responses to Sergey?
I think though, Sergey really does confirm. I mean, if you imagine this current crisis was playing out between two nuclear armed states, I think it would be much more dangerous for both countries. And again, while I can understand, since I'm associated with the Budapest Memorandum, I get beat up on it every time I go back to Kyiv. But I do try to remind Ukrainians that they themselves have concluded it would be too expensive to maintain an independent nuclear weapons capability. And I do try to remind them that there were things that happened that I think were useful for Ukraine in terms of building links to the West that would not have been possible had they kept the weapons. And,
Steve, they were so naive and incompetent about nuclear matters because everything was under Moscow control in the Soviet days.
Right. But again, I think they could have figured some things out, and it could have made this crisis a much more difficult crisis.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to Dr. Rogov for his comments. I mean, Ukrainians did have the entire missile army headquartered on their territory, and Yuzhmash, the largest missile factory in the world, and a couple of nuclear physics institute. I don't think there were, maybe the political leaders were initially incompetent or naive, as you say, but there was certainly enough know-how, and even the political leaders were quick to—
Technical knowledge, but not command and control of the nuclear forces. That was completely under the Strategic Forces Command in Moscow.
Agreed, but
and when they tried to take control of those nuclear weapons, they almost produced a nuclear explosion.
I think
we are now. Well, go ahead, Mariana. We're getting past
so
our time.
I think we agree more than we disagree. But there were what I would like to kind of end this presentation with is to impress perhaps upon all of us as people who are involved in these nuclear matters and who have some kind of impact on shaping policy, that kind of supporting the guy who's done the right thing by the international community and the non-proliferation regime is probably as important as kind of imposing costs on the guy who's doing the wrong thing, like Iran or North Korea. Both of these kind of positive and negative reinforcements, inducements, is what is going to make the non-proliferation regime strong and lasting. Thank you.
All right. On that note, I'm afraid I'll have to bring it to a close. Thank you all for coming. And thanks so much to Steve and Mariana for excellent discussion. Thanks.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.